hope, faith, and trust in something else, and just let you know that you're not in this alone, that you can get to where you want. You need that kind of emotional, spiritual crutch in your life. And this is what I wanted to ask you about, is that young people, they
Well,
seem to have that less and less. So how do we find
okay,
that
so
spiritual crutch
well,
is the question.
well, I wouldn't say it's a crutch. I don't think that's reasonable, because any
Okay.
genuine spiritual practice places a tremendous moral burden on its practitioner.
So let's say
And
foundation, a spiritual foundation is what I mean.
well, and some people need that more than others. Like if
Sure.
you're the sort of person who are, and I would say that that's likely associated with high trait openness.
Hmm.
That's the creativity dimension. And so if you find yourself yearning, well, how do you address that? Literature, art, that's the
Right.
domain. And then in that domain, there's the mystical religious domain and the philosophical domain. Well, reading is your best way into that. And you also describe the ritual practices, and they can be very useful to people. I mean, my wife found repetitive prayer of aid when she was undergoing interminable repeated scans for the
Yeah.
presence of cancer. It's like, well, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, one thing you can do is turn to a ritual. And you might say, well, that's a crutch. It's like, well, no, it's a practice. It's a
Sure.
meditative practice that helps regulate your physiological reactions under extreme duress. People who think that religious belief is a crutch, first of all, they're guilty of something I think is an unbelievable impediment to reasonable progress, which is casual contempt. Like, are you sure you know enough about that to be contemptuous of it? Religious belief has a history that's tens of thousands of years old. The capacity for religious experience, and perhaps even the need for it, is coded in us biologically. It's
Right.
unbelievably complicated problem and solution. You don't want to casually dismiss it. You can
Sure.
read philosophers and
Yeah.
great writers and great religious thinkers and great
Right.
psychoanalysts. Joseph Campbell, for example, is a great entry place for anyone who wants to take religious thinking seriously.
Right. And so this is where I'm getting at here is, so you're saying spiritual experience is encoded in our genes. And I agree with that. Whether, even people who say they're atheists or they don't believe, I think this is universal for everyone. But for people who don't have religion, who just have
Well,
ideology
the
or
atheists
don't
go
even
watch
have that.
Star Wars.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, the atheist materialist
Sure.
types, the engineers, skeptical and
Right.
unlikely to personalize the world, they get their mythology through science fiction and they
Sure.
don't
Yeah.
even notice it.
But people who don't have that spiritual practice, don't have that religion, who are watching Star Wars, participating in protests against white supremacy, how do they find that spiritual experience? How do they achieve that state? That's kind of the fundamental thing that I'm wrestling with as our society becomes more and more secular and saturated with technology and political polarization, all these other forces that seem to be distracting us from our inner
It's
primal
it's
need
it's
for spiritual experience.
I would say to some degree that's the fundamental unanswered question of our age.
Hmm.